Rolf Dobelli's The Art of Thinking Clearly is an enlightening exploration into the common cognitive biases and logical fallacies that influence our thinking and decision-making. The book is divided into 99 short chapters, each dedicated to a specific bias or fallacy, providing clear explanations and practical examples to help readers recognize and overcome these mental traps. Dobelli's insights are based on decades of research in psychology, behavioral economics, and neuroscience. Part 1: Cognitive Biases and Logical Fallacies. Survivorship Bias. Survivorship bias occurs when we focus on successful individuals or outcomes while ignoring those that failed. This leads to an overly optimistic view and skewed understanding of reality. By only considering the winners, we overlook the lessons that could be learned from the losers, leading to misguided conclusions. Swimmer's body illusion. This bias makes us mistake selection factors for results. For example, we may think swimmers have perfect bodies because they swim, but in reality, they swim well because they have the ideal physique for the sport. Recognizing this illusion helps us make more informed decisions by understanding the true reasons behind success. Clustering illusion. Humans have a tendency to see patterns where none exist. This bias makes us interpret random events as meaningful. Understanding the clustering illusion helps us avoid overinterpreting random data and making false assumptions based on coincidental occurrences. Social proof. Social proof is the tendency to conform to the actions of others, assuming they are making the right choices. This can lead to herd behavior and poor decision-making. Being aware of social proof allows us to critically evaluate situations and make independent decisions. Sunk cost fallacy. The sunk cost fallacy is the irrational decision to continue an endeavor once an investment in money, effort, or time has been made. This fallacy causes us to make decisions based on past investments rather than current benefits. Recognizing this fallacy helps us cut our losses and make more rational choices. Reciprocity. Reciprocity is the tendency to feel obligated to return favors. This social norm can be exploited by others to manipulate our decisions. By understanding the power of reciprocity, we can better assess situations and avoid being unduly influenced by others. Confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is the tendency to search for, interpret, and remember information that confirms our preconceptions. This bias leads to overconfidence in our beliefs and decisions. Recognizing confirmation bias helps us seek out diverse perspectives and make more balanced judgments. Authority bias. Authority bias is the tendency to attribute greater accuracy to the opinion of an authority figure and be more influenced by them. This can lead to poor decisions if the authority is not well informed. By questioning authority and seeking evidence, we can make more informed decisions. Contrast effect. The contrast effect is the distortion of perception caused by the comparison with recent experiences. This can affect our judgments and decisions. Being aware of the contrast effect helps us evaluate situations more objectively. Availability bias. Availability bias is the tendency to overestimate the importance of information that is readily available. This can lead to skewed perceptions and poor decisions. Recognizing availability bias helps us seek out comprehensive information and make more informed choices. Part 2: Decision-making pitfalls. Hindsight bias. Hindsight bias is the inclination to see events as having been predictable after they have occurred. This distorts our understanding of past events and our ability to learn from them. Recognizing hindsight bias helps us maintain a more accurate perspective on past decisions and outcomes. Overconfidence effect. Overconfidence effect is the tendency to overestimate our own abilities and the accuracy of our knowledge. This can lead to risky decisions and failures. By acknowledging our limitations and seeking feedback, we can make more realistic and prudent decisions. Base rate fallacy. The base rate fallacy occurs when we ignore statistical information in favor of specific information. This leads to flawed judgments and decisions. Recognizing the base rate fallacy helps us incorporate statistical data into our decision-making process. Gambler's fallacy. Gambler's fallacy is the belief that past random events affect the probability of future random events. This fallacy leads to irrational decisions in gambling and other areas of life. Understanding gambler's fallacy helps us make more rational decisions based on statistical probability. Anchoring effect. The anchoring effect is the tendency to rely too heavily on the first piece of information encountered, the anchor, when making decisions. This can lead to biased judgments. Being aware of the anchoring effect helps us seek out additional information and make more balanced decisions. Framing effect. The framing effect is the influence of how information is presented on our decisions. The same information can lead to different decisions depending on the framing. Recognizing the framing effect helps us evaluate information more objectively and make better choices. Regression to the mean. Regression to the mean is the tendency for extreme outcomes to return to the average over time. This can lead to misinterpretations of performance and success. Understanding regression to the mean helps us set more realistic expectations and avoid overreacting to short-term fluctuations. Outcome bias. Outcome bias is the tendency to judge a decision based on its outcome rather than the quality of the decision at the time it was made. This can lead to incorrect assessments of decision-making processes. By focusing on the decision-making process itself, we can make better decisions regardless of the outcome. Illusion of control. The illusion of control is the tendency to overestimate our ability to control events. This can lead to overconfident and risky behavior. Recognizing the illusion of control helps us assess situations more realistically and make more prudent decisions. Planning fallacy. The planning fallacy is the tendency to underestimate the time, costs, and risks of future actions while overestimating the benefits. This leads to overly optimistic plans and timelines. Understanding the planning fallacy helps us make more realistic plans and set achievable goals. Part 3: Social influences on thinking. Self-serving bias. Self-serving bias is the tendency to attribute positive outcomes to our own actions and negative outcomes to external factors. This bias distorts our self-perception and decision-making. By recognizing self-serving bias, we can develop a more accurate self-assessment and make better decisions. Optimism bias. Optimism bias is the tendency to believe that we are less likely to experience negative events and more likely to experience positive events. This can lead to unrealistic expectations and poor decision-making. Acknowledging optimism bias helps us prepare for potential challenges and make more balanced decisions. Fundamental attribution error. The fundamental attribution error is the tendency to attribute others' behavior to their character while underestimating situational factors. This can lead to misjudgments and poor decisions in social interactions. Recognizing this error helps us consider situational factors and make fairer assessments of others. Halo effect. The halo effect is the tendency to let our overall impression of a person influence our judgments about their specific traits. This can lead to biased evaluations. Being aware of the halo effect helps us separate our general impressions from specific assessments. Pessimism bias. Pessimism bias is the tendency to overestimate the likelihood of negative events. This can lead to undue anxiety and poor decision-making. Recognizing pessimism bias helps us adopt a more balanced outlook and make more rational decisions. Just world hypothesis. The just world hypothesis is the belief that the world is fair and people get what they deserve. This can lead to victim blaming and unrealistic expectations. By understanding the just world hypothesis, we can develop a more compassionate and realistic view of the world. Endowment effect. The endowment effect is the tendency to value something more highly simply because we own it. This can lead to irrational attachment to possessions and poor financial decisions. Recognizing the endowment effect helps us evaluate our possessions more objectively and make better decisions. Status quo bias. Status quo bias is the preference for the current state of affairs and the resistance to change. This can lead to missed opportunities and stagnation. By acknowledging status quo bias, we can be more open to change and make decisions that lead to growth and improvement. Negativity bias. Negativity bias is the tendency to give more weight to negative information than positive information. This can lead to an overly pessimistic view and poor decision-making. Recognizing negativity bias helps us adopt a more balanced perspective and make better decisions. Loss aversion. Loss aversion is the tendency to prefer avoiding losses over acquiring equivalent gains. This can lead to overly conservative decisions and missed opportunities. Understanding loss aversion helps us take calculated risks and make more balanced decisions. Part 4: Errors in Evaluating Evidence. Base rate neglect. Base rate neglect occurs when we ignore the general prevalence of an event in favor of specific information. This leads to flawed judgments and decisions. Recognizing base rate neglect helps us incorporate statistical data into our decision-making process. Conjunction fallacy. The conjunction fallacy occurs when we assume that specific conditions are more probable than general ones. This leads to illogical conclusions. Understanding the conjunction fallacy helps us evaluate probabilities more accurately and make better decisions. Post-purchase rationalization. Post-purchase rationalization is the tendency to justify a purchase after the fact, even if it was a bad decision. This can lead to continued poor financial choices. Recognizing this bias helps us make more rational decisions and learn from our mistakes. Hyperbolic discounting. Hyperbolic discounting is the tendency to prefer smaller, immediate rewards over larger, delayed rewards. This can lead to impulsive decisions and poor long-term planning. Understanding hyperbolic discounting helps us prioritize long-term benefits and make better decisions. Barnum effect. The Barnum effect is the tendency to believe vague, general statements as personally meaningful. This can lead to being misled by horoscopes and other pseudosciences. Recognizing the Barnum effect helps us critically evaluate information and avoid being deceived. Groupthink. Groupthink is the tendency for group members to conform to the consensus to avoid conflict, leading to poor decisions. Recognizing groupthink helps us encourage diverse perspectives and make better collective decisions. Neglect of probability. Neglect of probability is the tendency to disregard the actual likelihood of events when making decisions. This can lead to irrational fears and poor risk assessment. Understanding this bias helps us make decisions based on accurate probability assessments. Zero-risk bias. Zero-risk bias is the preference for reducing a small risk to zero over reducing a larger risk by a greater amount. This leads to suboptimal risk management. Recognizing zero-risk bias helps us make more effective risk reduction decisions. Information bias. Information bias is the tendency to seek more information even when it does not affect action. This can lead to analysis paralysis. Understanding information bias helps us focus on relevant information and make timely decisions. Belief bias. Belief bias is the tendency to judge arguments based on the believability of their conclusion rather than their logical validity. This can lead to poor reasoning. Recognizing belief bias helps us evaluate arguments more objectively and make better decisions. Part 5: Errors in Predicting the Future. Overplanning. Overplanning is the tendency to create detailed plans that do not account for unexpected events. This leads to rigid and unrealistic strategies. Recognizing overplanning helps us build flexibility into our plans and better adapt to changes. Black swan effect. The black swan effect refers to the impact of highly improbable and unpredictable events. This leads to an underestimation of uncertainty. Understanding the black swan effect helps us prepare for the unexpected and build resilience. Narrative fallacy. The narrative fallacy is the tendency to create coherent stories from random facts, leading to false conclusions. Recognizing this fallacy helps us seek evidence-based explanations and avoid oversimplifications. Prediction error. Prediction error is the tendency to overestimate our ability to predict the future. This leads to unrealistic expectations and poor planning. Understanding prediction error helps us set more realistic goals and better manage uncertainty. Scenario thinking. Scenario thinking is the tendency to envision future scenarios based on current trends, which can limit our adaptability. Recognizing the limitations of scenario thinking helps us remain open to unexpected changes and better prepare for diverse outcomes. Extrapolation bias. Extrapolation bias is the tendency to project current trends indefinitely into the future. This leads to unrealistic forecasts. Understanding extrapolation bias helps us recognize the limits of trends and make more accurate predictions. Action bias. Action bias is the tendency to favor action over inaction, even when inaction would be more beneficial. This leads to unnecessary interventions and potential harm. Recognizing action bias helps us evaluate when it is best to act or refrain from acting. Outcome knowledge. Outcome knowledge is the tendency to judge past decisions based on their outcomes rather than the decision-making process. This leads to incorrect evaluations of our past actions. Understanding outcome knowledge helps us learn from the decision-making process itself and improve future decisions. Effect heuristic. The effect heuristic is the tendency to rely on emotions to make decisions. This can lead to irrational choices based on immediate feelings. Recognizing the effect heuristic helps us incorporate rational analysis into our decision-making process. Frequency illusion. The frequency illusion is the tendency to notice something more frequently after learning about it. This leads to an overestimation of its prevalence. Understanding the frequency illusion helps us assess information more objectively and avoid biased perceptions. Part 6: Errors in remembering the past. False memory. False memory is the tendency to remember events differently from how they occurred or to remember events that never happened. This distorts our perception of the past. Recognizing false memory helps us critically evaluate our recollections and seek corroborative evidence. Recency effect. The recency effect is the tendency to remember recent events more vividly than earlier ones. This can skew our perception of trends and patterns. Understanding the recency effect helps us take a broader view of our experiences and make more balanced assessments. Rosy retrospection. Rosy retrospection is the tendency to remember past events more positively than they were. This can lead to unrealistic expectations and decisions. Recognizing rosy retrospection helps us maintain a more accurate view of the past and make better decisions. Self-enhancing transmission bias. Self-enhancing transmission bias is the tendency to transmit information that enhances our self-image. This can distort our recollection and communication of events. Understanding this bias helps us communicate more honestly and make more accurate assessments. Fading effect bias. Fading effect bias is the tendency for negative emotions to fade more quickly than positive ones. This can lead to a distorted view of past experiences. Recognizing fading effect bias helps us maintain a balanced perspective on past events. Egocentric bias. Egocentric bias is the tendency to overemphasize our own role in past events. This can lead to a skewed perception of our influence. Understanding egocentric bias helps us evaluate past events more objectively and accurately. Bizarreness effect. The bizarreness effect is the tendency to remember bizarre or unusual information better than mundane information. This can distort our memory of events. Recognizing the bizarreness effect helps us understand the factors that influence our recollections. Memory inhibition. Memory inhibition is the tendency to forget irrelevant or less important information. This can affect our recollection of past events. Understanding memory inhibition helps us recognize the selective nature of our memory and seek corroborative evidence. Tip of the tongue phenomenon. The tip of the tongue phenomenon is the feeling of knowing something but being unable to recall it. This can lead to frustration and incorrect recollections. Recognizing this phenomenon helps us understand the limitations of our memory and seek alternative ways to recall information. Cryptomnesia. Cryptomnesia is the tendency to remember ideas as original when they are actually from another source. This can lead to unintentional plagiarism. Understanding cryptomnesia helps us acknowledge our influences and give credit where it is due. Part 7, Errors in Evaluating Ourselves and Others. Self-handicapping. Self-handicapping is the tendency to create obstacles to success, to protect our self-esteem from potential failure. This leads to self-sabotage and missed opportunities. Recognizing self-handicapping helps us take responsibility for our actions and strive for success. Illusion of transparency. The illusion of transparency is the tendency to overestimate the extent to which others can understand our internal states. This can lead to miscommunication and misunderstandings. Understanding this illusion helps us communicate more clearly and effectively. Spotlight effect. The spotlight effect is the tendency to overestimate how much others notice our actions and appearance. This can lead to unnecessary self-consciousness. Recognizing the spotlight effect helps us relax and focus on our actions rather than others' perceptions. Egocentric bias in attribution. Egocentric bias in attribution is the tendency to attribute successes to internal factors and failures to external factors. This distorts our self-assessment. Understanding this bias helps us develop a more accurate view of our abilities and actions. Illusion of asymmetric insight. The illusion of asymmetric insight is the belief that we understand others better than they understand us. This can lead to overconfidence in our judgments. Recognizing this illusion helps us remain open to others' perspectives and improve our understanding. Forer effect. The Forer effect is the tendency to accept vague and general personality descriptions as uniquely applicable to oneself. This can lead to being misled by pseudosciences. Understanding the Forer effect helps us critically evaluate personality assessments. Not invented here syndrome. Not invented here syndrome is the tendency to reject ideas from outside sources in favor of our own ideas. This can lead to missed opportunities and limited innovation. Recognizing this syndrome helps us remain open to external ideas and improve our decision-making. False consensus effect. The false consensus effect is the tendency to overestimate the extent to which others share our beliefs and behaviors. This leads to biased perceptions of social norms. Understanding this effect helps us recognize diversity in perspectives and behaviors. Projection bias. Projection bias is the tendency to project our current feelings and preferences onto others. This can lead to misunderstandings and poor judgments. Recognizing projection bias helps us consider others' perspectives and make more accurate assessments. Outgroup homogeneity bias. Outgroup homogeneity bias is the tendency to perceive members of outgroups as more similar to each other than members of our in-group. This leads to stereotyping and discrimination. Understanding this bias helps us appreciate individual differences and avoid prejudices. Part 8, Errors in Judging Situations. Actor-observer bias. Actor-observer bias is the tendency to attribute our own actions to situational factors while attributing others' actions to their character. This leads to biased judgments. Recognizing this bias helps us consider situational factors in evaluating others' actions. Moral licensing. Moral licensing is the tendency to justify immoral behavior after doing something moral. This leads to inconsistency in our actions. Understanding moral licensing helps us strive for consistent ethical behavior. Unit bias. Unit bias is the tendency to think that a single unit of something, e.g., a serving size, is the appropriate amount. This can lead to overconsumption. Recognizing unit bias helps us make more informed choices about quantities. Effort justification. Effort justification is the tendency to attribute greater value to outcomes that require more effort. This can lead to overvaluing difficult tasks. Understanding effort justification helps us evaluate outcomes more objectively. Hyperbolic discounting in time. Hyperbolic discounting in time is the tendency to favor immediate rewards over future benefits. This leads to poor long-term planning. Recognizing this bias helps us prioritize long-term goals and make better decisions. Money illusion. Money illusion is the tendency to think of money in nominal rather than real terms, ignoring inflation. This leads to incorrect financial decisions. Understanding money illusion helps us make better financial choices. Overprecision. Overprecision is the tendency to be too certain of the accuracy of our knowledge. This leads to overconfidence and errors. Recognizing overprecision helps us remain open to new information and adjust our beliefs accordingly. Expectation bias. Expectation bias is the tendency to see what we expect to see, leading to confirmation of our preconceptions. This distorts our perception of reality. Understanding expectation bias helps us seek evidence-based information and challenge our assumptions. Placebo effect. The placebo effect is the tendency for people to experience real effects from fake treatments due to their expectations. This highlights the power of belief. Recognizing the placebo effect helps us understand the influence of expectations on our experiences. Scarcity error. Scarcity error is the tendency to value things more when they are scarce. This leads to irrational decisions based on perceived scarcity. Understanding this error helps us evaluate the true value of items and make better choices. Part 9: Errors in Evaluating Relationships. Similarity attraction effect. The similarity attraction effect is the tendency to be attracted to people who are similar to us. This can limit our social interactions. Recognizing this effect helps us appreciate diversity and expand our social networks. Halo effect in relationships. The halo effect in relationships is the tendency to let our overall impression of a person influence our judgments about their specific traits. This leads to biased evaluations. Understanding this effect helps us separate our general impressions from specific assessments. Social comparison bias. Social comparison bias is the tendency to compare ourselves to others, which can affect our self-esteem and relationships. Recognizing this bias helps us focus on our own growth and appreciate others' achievements without envy. Reciprocal liking. Reciprocal liking is the tendency to like people who like us. This can influence our social interactions and relationships. Understanding this tendency helps us recognize the mutual nature of many relationships. Mere exposure effect. The mere exposure effect is the tendency to develop a preference for things simply because we are familiar with them. This can influence our preferences and relationships. Recognizing this effect helps us seek out new experiences and evaluate our preferences more objectively. Proximity effect. The proximity effect is the tendency to develop relationships with people who are physically close to us. This can limit our social circles. Understanding this effect helps us expand our social interactions beyond immediate surroundings. Propinquity effect. The propinquity effect is the increased likelihood of forming relationships with people we frequently encounter. This highlights the importance of repeated interactions. Recognizing this effect helps us understand the dynamics of relationship formation. Ben Franklin effect. The Ben Franklin effect is the tendency to like someone more after doing them a favor. This can influence our relationships. Understanding this effect helps us recognize the power of helping others in building positive relationships. Cheerleader effect. The cheerleader effect is the tendency to perceive individuals as more attractive when they are in a group. This can influence our social perceptions. Recognizing this effect helps us evaluate individuals more objectively. Group attribution error. Group attribution error is the tendency to assume that the characteristics of an individual group member apply to the entire group. This leads to stereotyping. Understanding this error helps us appreciate individual differences and avoid prejudices. Part 10: Errors in Personal Decision-Making. Planning fallacy in personal goals. The planning fallacy in personal goals is the tendency to underestimate the time and effort required to achieve personal objectives. This leads to unrealistic plans. Recognizing this fallacy helps us set more achievable goals. Affect bias in personal choices. Affect bias in personal choices is the tendency to make decisions based on immediate emotions rather than long-term benefits. This leads to impulsive decisions. Understanding this bias helps us prioritize long-term benefits and make better choices. Self-serving bias in personal achievements. Self-serving bias in personal achievements is the tendency to attribute successes to internal factors and failures to external factors. This distorts our self-assessment. Understanding this bias helps us develop a more accurate view of our abilities and actions. Endowment effect in personal possessions. The endowment effect in personal possessions is the tendency to value our belongings more highly simply because we own them. This can lead to irrational attachment to possessions. Recognizing this effect helps us evaluate our belongings more objectively and make better decisions. Hyperbolic discounting in personal finance. Hyperbolic discounting in personal finance is the tendency to prefer immediate financial rewards over larger, delayed rewards. This leads to poor long-term financial planning. Understanding this bias helps us prioritize long-term financial goals and make better financial decisions. Overconfidence bias in personal abilities. Overconfidence bias in personal abilities is the tendency to overestimate our own skills and knowledge. This leads to risky decisions and failures. Recognizing this bias helps us seek feedback and improve our self-assessment. Confirmation bias in personal beliefs. Confirmation bias in personal beliefs is the tendency to seek out information that confirms our preconceptions. This leads to overconfidence in our beliefs. Recognizing this bias helps us seek diverse perspectives and make more balanced judgments. Social proof in personal decisions. Social proof in personal decisions is the tendency to conform to the actions of others, assuming they are making the right choices. This leads to herd behavior. Understanding this bias helps us make independent decisions based on our own evaluations. Authority bias in personal choices. Authority bias in personal choices is the tendency to attribute greater accuracy to the opinion of an authority figure and be more influenced by them. This can lead to poor decisions if the authority is not well informed. Recognizing this bias helps us question authority and seek evidence for our decisions. Conclusion. Rolf Dobelli's The Art of Thinking Clearly offers valuable insights into the cognitive biases and logical fallacies that affect our thinking and decision-making. By understanding these biases and fallacies, we can improve our critical thinking skills and make better decisions in various aspects of our lives. The book encourages us to question our assumptions, seek diverse perspectives, and remain open to new information. Ultimately, The Art of Thinking Clearly is a guide to navigating the complexities of human cognition and making more rational choices.